Before we get started, we'd like to recognize our sponsor. Our sponsor today is Georgia Power, and we'd like to thank Georgia Power for sponsoring today's webinar. We have a message and a video from Georgia Power today as our sponsor.
At Georgia Power, we believe it's our responsibility to be an active champion of the communities we serve. That's why we're excited to stand with our communities to tackle systemic equity issues across our state. We're committing $87 million to address these issues over the next 5 years, focusing on supporting and partnering with organizations that assist with education equity, criminal justice, energy justice, and economic empowerment. And we're building a team of more than 250 employees who will serve as mentors to our state's young people, helping shape Georgia's future leaders. This financial investment and our commitment to mentoring, while just a part of our overall equity efforts, are one way we can make a real impact in distressed and disadvantaged communities and continue to be a champion for all Georgians.
Once again, we'd like to thank today's sponsor. Our sponsor today is Georgia Power. As I mentioned earlier, we have a great webinar scheduled today that our presenter is going to talk about daring and inclusive leadership. So we're excited to hear what today's presenter has. Today's presenter is Pearl Alexander, and she is an executive leadership and human capital strategist and certified to DARE lead facilitator. She coaches and facilitates on topics that strengthens vision, shift mindsets, and navigate chaos and transitions. Frequently tapped to solve the most sensitive and complex people challenges of these times, her career assignments have spanned from conflict management and peace building to spokesperson and inclusive strategist. Currently, Pearl serves as a lead DE&I strategist and Chief Culture Coach in the Office of Institute Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. So at this time, please join me in giving our speaker today, Pearl Alexander, a virtual round of applause as we welcome her to this month's Embrace webinar.
Thank you so much, Freddie. I appreciate the invitation to be here and to share a few thoughts with you all today. Let me just be sure I can get my PowerPoint here on the screen. There we go. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So I appreciate being with you. We're going to talk today about some of the current issues that we're up against and how we show up as leaders in this context that we are finding ourselves in now, and some really important considerations along the way for that. As Freddie was sharing, I serve at the Georgia Institute of Technology in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And one of the things that we have found there to be really important, and I'll share a little of what I'm doing there along the way with you, is really focusing on leadership development. And daring and inclusive leadership are concepts that we are bringing to our people leaders at Georgia Tech, because we know that the times we're in really call for a different type of leadership, different way of showing up with people. So let me just jump in here to this content, and there are a couple of points along the way where I will invite you to place some comments or reflections in the chat, and to the extent that Freddie, you can see those and can share them with me, would love to be able to pause in that way to keep you engaged along the way. As a coach, that's one of my favorite things to do, is to ask questions that cause people to think deeply. And so you'll experience a little bit of that as well. I want to begin by talking about the ways we're going to have to transform our organizations, but also to think about that in the context of how we're going to transform ourselves, right? Because organizations are made up of people, and what we know is that there are three transformational elements of organizations that we have to pay attention to right now. There's strategy, and that's where a lot of us have expertise and probably a lot of pride around the work that we do in creating these strategies and our strategic planning efforts and so forth. I think in this time we're in now, we have to focus on more than that. To be successful as organizations, we have to focus on culture. In the world that we're in right now, we're up against talent challenges and shortages, and it's a talent-driven market right now. Talent has the upper hand. I was recently reading where we've had organizational quit rates, right? QUIT, quit rates of as many as 4 million people in a month's time across the country. We're up against inflation, and our spending power is down. We are up against return to office amid more and more variants of this COVID-19 virus. We're up against people feeling burnout and overwhelmed, political polarization, social unrest, and inequities that continue. And so what it is that talent seems to be focusing on right now is not so much our strategies, but our culture and our structures. And what are we doing to put into place structures, changes in policies that allow flexibility, that allow for some of the diversity and intersectionality that we bring to the workplace. And then when we do show up with all of that, how do we get treated? What is the lived experience that we have within organizations? One of my favorite authors, and you heard it mentioned that I'm a certified Dare to Lead professional facilitator, is Brene Brown. So Dr. Brene Brown works at the University of Houston and these days is a celebrity researcher. And just at the beginning of the pandemic, she talked about the collective trauma that we were all experiencing and elements that society that we were up against in the midst of that, so much so that we were calling it a double pandemic or referring to it as a double pandemic. And she said something really, really important, and I believe is true. What we need from our leaders is changing. And I'm curious to hear from you, if you have comments about that. What do you think is changing right now about what people need from leaders in the midst of all these challenges, this VUCA world that we're in? What are some of those changes? And just put those into the chat. What questions do you have about that? Because you can also put that into the Q&A, because I'd love to hear from you on this. I'm going to make a few more comments and then I'm going to circle back to see what maybe is in the chat and to hear the voices that are with me today. One of my favorite quotes from Brene is, "Who we are is how we lead." And this concept, I think, is so powerful, because part of it is also this concept of we have to be self-aware. Who we are is how we lead connotes that we have to know who we are. We have to know ourselves inside and out and how we show up with people. And we have to care for ourselves in order to show up and bring our best selves to serve the people who we work with every day. So we have to work on ourselves, not just the strategies, because it is our collective being together that creates this culture within organizations that's either going to allow us to keep the talent that we have and the diversity of talent that we have, or recruit the diversity of talent that we need. So I'm going to pause for some self-reflection. Let me just ask before we jump into the self-reflection, though, are there any questions, comments, Freddie, that you can share with me?
So looking at some of the comments, I see trust, flexibility in the workplace, flexible scheduling, compassionate leaders, transparent leaders, someone to listen and help. Someone says, we talk a lot about the tools to be successful in the workplace, but we also need to provide the tools needed to be successful away from the workplace. So classes on financial literacy, work-life balance, daycare, housing, etc.
Oh man, I wish I could see this audience, because this audience is brilliant.
Accountability is another one that's coming up.
Accountability. People want accountability, and they want to come to work in places where there's trust, transparency, where we care. You all are talking about elements of the culture that are so important right now. And so as we continue on with some self-reflection, it sounds like you know, but just to reiterate the importance of how we influence people and how we use our influence for good. And what I'm going to also invite you to do is, we're thinking about some of these concepts, is one word. What's one word that might guide your leadership journey going forward, that will anchor you in who you want to be as a leader? Not necessarily who you are right this minute, but who you want to be, and something that's going to speak to your higher self about how you want to move in the world and amongst your teams and organizations. Because the culture of an organization is shaped by the worst behavior that the leader is willing to tolerate. I think you find that to be true, right? And so as we think about leadership, I always like to reflect on your relationship with power, right? What is your relationship to power? And what is the emotional fluency and resilience that we need right now? So we'll talk more about that, but towards the end, the last question I'll ask you to reflect on and share feedback on is your one word. So as you think about leadership and as you think about these concepts, keep that in mind. So what we know is there's position power, and then there's personal power. And literature says that the most effective leaders are those who can balance that personal power, position power. And in the absence of personal power, or that ability to influence and to have some efficacy around what it is we want to do, we lean more heavily on position power. Or if we don't have the emotional fluency to influence through personal power, we lean more heavily on position power. And we'll talk about the experience that people have when you lean on position power very shortly. But the most effective leaders, there's some overlap here. There's, in these concentric circles, there's some overlap. And right there in the middle is what makes a leader very, very effective. When they know who they are, they're able to bring that personal power to bear on situations. They don't always have to lean on position power. When you don't lean on position power as much, you connect more with people. Here's a little bit more research from the Neuroleadership Institute, one of my actual favorite institutions and go-to institutions in the work that we're doing. This SCARF model that was created by Dr. David Rock. And he says that these are some of the elements that might show up that cause people to react, either what is being perceived as behavior that is threatening and or behavior that is rewarding. When we talk about inclusion and belonging, one of the key things that we have to focus on is minimizing threat responses in others. And what activates that threat response in others? It's when they feel that a loss of status, a lack of certainty, autonomy, relatedness, or fairness. This is called the SCARF model. That's the acronym, and it's a tool that I encourage you to think about and use. But as we go up the ladder in leadership, that position power, one of the things that we have to be careful of is that we don't disconnect from people and show up in ways that's totally focused on the position, so our vision and our goals, and less on the care of the people and the culture that we're creating together with them. Because we're not creating the reward response. Most likely, we are creating the threat response in the organization, where people don't feel like they have psychological safety, and it creates all kinds of dynamics that are challenging in the organization. So what we want to focus on is creating culture that is focused on connection and safety. Psychological safety is really important. Again, I'll refer to some of the literature, and Brene talks about this in hers as well, that if you're daring as a leader, then you have to care for and be connected to the people you serve. And that was brought out in your comments earlier, so I want to thank you for that, because that's huge, really big and important for people. And especially right now, and it's one of the reasons people are leaving jobs. They don't feel fulfilled, they don't feel seen and valued and heard. They don't have that psychological safety, so they are more willing to take the risk of finding something else and different, and having some success at that. Another aspect of culture that's important is living into our values, right? So a lot of us have organizational values, but if we haven't taken the time to really define those values and live those values every day, then we're not walking our talk. And that's another reason that people will tend to take their talents elsewhere. Or when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, if any of those are values, or all of those are values, and you're not clearly defining how you're living those values, and people see that transparency around that, then again, the impact of that is people check out, people, don't bring their best selves to work. So we're not getting the productivity. We're not making the best decisions that we can make under those circumstances. And it creates a culture of what Brene refers to as scarcity. Now, to make it a little more personal, and this is where I'm going to get some feedback from you again as we talk about this concept of shame, because one of the things that Brene is very famous for is her work around shame and vulnerability. And she says that, you know, one of the reasons we struggle with our own vulnerability, and vulnerability being how we show up under circumstances of risk and emotional exposure. One of the reasons we struggle is because we don't know about or haven't dealt with our own personal relationship to shame. So today, again, to introduce a concept, let's talk a little bit about shame. It is a very powerful emotion, and it drives the fear that we aren't good enough. And so when this shame emotion is driving us, we hustle for our own worthiness. Shame drives two tapes for people: not worthy, not good enough, and or who do you think you are? And so when we as leaders aren't confident, don't show up with confidence in who we are, it could be because we are struggling with this concept of shame. Where does it come from? It comes from the stories, the existing scripts and beliefs that we have or have been subject to as we're growing up. So I want you to think about that. Like, what are some of the existing scripts, beliefs, or storylines that you might still be carrying with you that no longer serve you? Because when you show up with those in the organization, we're creating more of that culture of scarcity. And if we're hustling as leaders, guess what? That's right, everybody else around us is hustling with their worthiness too. So think back and share into the chat. Those are the types of scripts that are here on the screen. Things like don't express your feelings. Don't ask questions. Always be in control. Always look good. That was one they used to tell me. You know, you have to look good, show up, look good, and, you know what you're talking about. Scripts like I'm right, you know, things that might be in your head when you, from parents, teachers, siblings, you know, hurry up and grow up. Do as I say, not as I do. Don't think or talk, just follow direction. Don't cry. Big boys don't cry. We won't love you if. I'm sacrificing myself for you. So if you feel safe enough, and I will ask that people not share things that I don't think anybody can see all of that, but if you can, those things that are personal, we should hold in confidence. But just for the experience of today and this learning how to process what we think and feel as leaders, I want to invite you to put into the chat just a script, something that maybe you were told, something that influenced you, and we'll see that these things have turned into chain triggers that may still be with us today and that may influence our behavior as leaders. Feel free to put any of that into the chat that comes up for you. And I'll circle back to that in just a moment. Here are some ways that these shame triggers and behaviors show up in our lives and in our work. We start to care more about what others think than we think. We struggle with perfectionism when there's really no such thing as perfect. We numb, in lots of different ways. Everything from, the use of alcohol to shopping or Facebook and TikTok, right? Yeah. We stay in comparison mode. We're busy all the time. And we think of productivity as self-worth. Now, these are some things that Brene wrote about a long time ago, and a little over 10 years ago, as a matter of fact, in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, which was recently reproduced and published. And those things are things now that she talks about influence our leadership and our capacity to be with and lead others. That's why I bring this up. And a lot of our behaviors, these types of behaviors, are shame driven and relate back to those scripts and beliefs that we may have developed as we matured along the way. They don't serve us anymore at the time we created those, though. They protected us and allowed us to actually survive. And so it's important for us to recognize when we might be experiencing shame, and the fact that in order to process shame effectively, we have to experience empathy. And someone had mentioned earlier the importance of compassion, and that being an attribute of leadership going forward. I think that's absolutely true. And one of the elements of that is empathy. One of the elements of compassion is empathy. And so here are some of the attributes of empathy that I think are really, really important to actually demonstrate as leaders. Perspective taking, right? To be able to see something through someone else's eyes, to experience a little bit of what they go through. This is where storytelling and hearing people's stories is so impactful if we're willing to listen. Recognizing emotion. We have to be emotionally fluent and notice when others might be struggling. To also appreciate it when they're not, to recognize when people are happy and appreciative and enjoying what they do. To be able to communicate that emotion outside of judgment. Like, don't put your judgment on why you think they might be feeling a certain kind of a way, but really listen to them and be willing to stay open to whatever it is they have to say, and to be mindful in how we interact with people. When we're mindful, that means we are open to whatever it is that's happening. We're paying attention. There's an attentiveness there. and we're not overreacting to anything or underreacting, but we're just willing to be with people, knowing that we all are here and working and bringing our common humanity to work. And so things are going to happen, but to be with each other through those things, just as we had to show up very much together as we've gone through this pandemic together. And just leaning into what is and being okay with that, and knowing that we have the fortitude to figure out what we need to resolve conflicts or to move forward. So before we talk a little bit, and the last thing we'll talk about is armor, I would love to hear what are some of those scripts. I'm going to circle back now, and in fact, I'm going to pause right there and circle back and see what got layered in, if anything, into the chat.
All right, we had two comments. One that said, the top of the food chain is lonely for some leaders, so when it comes to that feelings, they just can't share those feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And another one said, you must be twice as good as the other person. If you want to be respected for who you are, you have to know and do that.
Yes, and that one resonates with me as well. Right, that you have to be so much better. A lot of times people of color are told that, and have lived that experience of having to be so much better to be recognized for in the same way as others, and that brings up an interesting question, right, for deliberation, because when we talk about armor and protecting ourselves, sometimes what puts us into protection mode is the little things that are happening in the organization, the micro messages that we're getting, the real opportunities that we're not getting. And there's cause for protection. And I love the juxtaposition of the comments, because the other is, sometimes you just can't be that vulnerable as a leader. So I want to share, that brings me to something I did want to also share about ways that we can show up and be vulnerable with others as leaders, because sometimes we can't share everything. But what we can model are some ways of being that allow us to function better, to feel connected, because our sense of belonging and inclusion has everything to do with how well we feel connected in organizations, and whether or not people care, whether or not we feel heard and listened to and valued. But it means that when we can be vulnerable, we can share what we're really thinking. We can show up in ways that Brene calls daring versus armor. So we can help others cultivate a sense of belonging. We can tell our truths. We don't have to code switch, and there's not a one size fits all type of way of being as a leader. These are some things that can happen in organizations, and the types of cultures that will allow people to show up, do their best work, and actually be engaged in the organization. we can feel as though, we can find ways to feel as though we are enough. We can practice, as I mentioned before, living our values. Because if we can do that, if we can just keep it real, right, and not be overcome with ego and position power, then, and we can use our position power for good and to make equitable decisions, then I think we're on the right track. And so this notion of armor, a lot of times, you know, we're struggling because we might be dealing with shame or other types of negative emotions. Sometimes we're dealing with armor, and that is just protection from, protecting ourselves from what we perceive to be challenges and barriers to our success. And we talked about this using power over quite a bit versus using power with, where we show up with those attributes we talked about, where we can trust others, where we listen to other people, where we hear ideas, where we empower others to do things. That makes a difference, right? And so we have to really self-reflect to figure out if we're showing up armored or daring. This is a big one, and this is one we sort of tried to learn to lean into over the last few years, but I don't know how well we've done. I'm curious about how well you've done in your organizations, or people in your organizations are leaning into hard conversations, especially those around social justice and equity. Feel free to layer that into the chat. You know, do you feel like you're making progress, or do you feel like, oh, we did that for a little while, right? We did that, you know, in the spring of 2020, but 2 years down the road, we're not doing so well at that anymore. What we found was that was cathartic for people, and it was helpful for people to learn. We probably learned a lot more history than we've ever learned in many ways in those short 2 years, you know, but yet still we're still hearing about these travesties every day of people losing their lives in racially motivated crimes and other ways, right? There's not only the racially motivated, but there's a lot of constant crime against people who identify as LGBTQIA. Another way we show up armored versus daring is that exhaustion as a status symbol. And you see that came directly from Brené's early research on the gifts of imperfection, right? This is an armored leadership behavior when we are so busy and we attach productivity to self-worth. Then that forces people who work with us to behave the same way, and therefore creating a culture where we're not promoting rest or play. And that is a culture of scarcity rather than a culture of enough. And then the last one I'll mention is armored leadership versus daring leadership, behaviors related to leading from hurt versus leading from heart. And I want to read directly from an excerpt directly from an article Brene wrote on this. And in the article, she says, one of the patterns I've observed is in working with leaders is that many people lead from a place of hurt and smallness. And they use their position of power to try to fill a self-worth gap. Leading from hurt rather than leading from heart means we're working our stuff out on other people. And because we're not addressing the real driver of our pain, this behavior isn't an occasional angry slip. Rather, it's a feeling of hurt that becomes a habit. Leading from hurt behaviors can be fueled by feeling no value from our partners or our children, so we double down on being seen as important at work. First family stuff, we talked a little bit about this, can look like seeking the approval and acceptance from colleagues that we never receive from our parents. And also, if our parents' professional failures and disappointments shaped our upbringing, then we can spend our careers trying to undo that pain. And that often takes the shape of insatiable appetites for recognition and success, of unproductive competition, and on occasion, of having zero tolerance for risk. Identifying the source of pain that's driving how we lead and how we show up for other people is important, because returning to that place and doing the work is the only real fix. So I ask you, how will you do your work? If you do your work and it includes social justice, then we will choose to see, we will choose to acknowledge, and we will choose to transform those policies and practices that have disparate impacts. Who do you want to be? I believe everyone can contribute when it comes to social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I love this quote from Mary Pfeiffer, who says, "The way we change the world is 1,000,000 individual acts of kindness." It will take 1,000,000 individual acts of kindness and courage for us to change our organizations, for sure. How will you cultivate the legacy you want to leave? So reflect for a moment and then feel free to layer into the chat your one word that will anchor your leadership journey forward and will help you to be a more daring and inclusive leader. As you layer your words into the chat, I want to see if there's a question or two that I might respond to as well. And if so, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, I do see one question.
Mhm.
Says, how do you handle a leader who is not self-aware?
Great question. So I will say this from a couple of different perspectives, right? If you report to that person, that's going to be a challenge, right? Because they may, for sure, not be able to hear your feedback. Sometimes 360-degree assessments can help. If you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion office that you can talk to, or practitioner that you can talk to, or HR person, that's another route. What we do for those people is invite them to participate in some of the work that we're doing to help them become more self-aware. It is a critical element of leadership development in any organization. And leadership development isn't something that you do for a little while or you do one time and you're done. It is a lifestyle and it is a journey. And coaching is one of the other and best ways that I've seen to support leaders who aren't self-aware. Usually that message has to come from someone above that person, especially if there isn't the trust and the psychological safety amongst the team for people to be able to say that. And that's unfortunate.
You have another question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions for self-awareness training?
Yes, there are some. So if you're on LinkedIn, there's some, and you Google that topic, a lot of resources will come up and some of them are free. Some of the best self-awareness trainings are also in some of the self-help, I call them self-help books in the libraries and in the bookstores. And I'm happy to share a few of my favorites that can be maybe shared with you all after this. But there are actually books like there's a self-awareness project, a self-love project, because a lot of times, we aren't told that an important aspect of leadership is self-reflection. But any type of self-reflection journal that you can use daily, I still use one daily, that, where I answer the questions about where I didn't show up like I wanted to today, and where I was subjected to someone who maybe just showed up and wasn't self-aware, just so I can start to navigate, how I feel about that, and how to, and my need to process that so that that energy is not between me and that person in an ongoing sort of negative fashion. But I'd be happy to share a few resources around self-awareness. If you have leadership development practices in your organizations, they are also great sources of tools. But sometimes if you have to find them for yourselves, the other thing I would say is look for a great life coach, leadership or life coach, and work with them one-on-one around your goals related to self-awareness. And there's usually a list of those. If you go to the International Coach Federation website, ICF is the acronym, they have a list of coaches and all the different types of coaches that are available. And most of them will not cost you anything, just to have a discovery sort of conversation to find out if you actually want to work with them or not. But I highly recommend coaching. I feel like all leaders need a coach, but most leaders don't get one unless they have a problem. One of the things we're doing in our organization is proactively working with folks so they can come and get coaching without having a 360, without having anything other than a desire to want to grow.
Okay. I have another question. As a leader, how do one control their tone of voice for others to accept it?
Very good question. That requires a balance between speaking your truth and animation, right, is what I call it. Sometimes you're just, your perception, the perception that others have of you is because you are in fact being authentic and sharing. And I think when we are able to be vulnerable and share with people, that there's less opportunity to be misunderstood. But it does take, part of emotional fluency is that social aspect and knowing when we're coming across to others in a way that we don't intend. Sometimes it's the inflection in the voice or on a particular word that makes someone question, or receive something that wasn't intended. So another thing to do, and I think it's really bold, but you ask, right? You ask simply, how are people understanding? Do you understand? Are we on the same page? How am I coming across to you in this conversation? Right? You see, leadership is a relationship. And just like in any other relationship, we have to have an understanding of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, where we're creating some type of artificial barriers, because what we do as human beings is when we hear things, we put an interpretation on that, and it's natural, right? And that usually that first interpretation is loaded with bias. And we have to work through bias filters and get to some degree of understanding, and not just assume or make up a story about what happened, right? Because that's what we naturally do. We naturally will make up a story about everything, what we heard, how it was said to us, the message behind the story. And sometimes those are just conspiracies and confabulations. Conspiracies or confabulations. Things we say honestly, but we really have no proof.
Okay. I don't see any more questions. I do have a lot of the one words.
Yes, tell me the words.
Let's see. Visionary, active listener, see, accessible, emotional control, honorable, courageous. And several people say listening.
Yeah.
Insight, approachable.
Yeah, approachable. Listeners. Yeah.
Love.
So these words are words of integrity. And in closing, I will say that is very powerful. And I want to invite you to live your word, make it visible, make it something visible to yourself, to remind yourself of who you want to be and how you want to show up, because these are difficult times in which we lead. And we have that additional opportunity to influence others and to be a power and a force for good in the world. So thank you for your time today. I have enjoyed being with you. and hope that this was helpful for you on your leadership journey.
And there is a question about the PowerPoint. So we will send out a copy of the PowerPoint, and we're also recording this webinar as well, which will be available on our website.